This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the UN and Israel. Why does the international body target the Jewish state while seemingly giving a free pass to Hamas? And human shields. Israeli soldiers say Hamas fighters are hiding behind women and children, even in the midst of a firefight. Plus, from the Gaza Strip, ordinary people speak out against the Hamas regime and call for peace with Israel. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Despite a declared three-day truce, fighting continued between Israel and Hamas. Meanwhile, negotiators went to Cairo to try to bring an end to the war now in its fourth week. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed that the war won't end until the threat of terror tunnels is eliminated. And the IDF announced one Israeli soldier has been abducted through one of those terror tunnels. And the U.S. and the UN criticized Israel for an attack on a UN facility. The White House called the attack at the UN school unacceptable and indefensible. Nearly 20 people died during the attack, but Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Ron Dermer told CBN News the incident demonstrates how Hamas places its military infrastructure within civilian areas and continues to use Palestinians as human shields.
They are forcing Israel, in order to defend ourselves, to attack those areas. They want us to kill Palestinian civilians because what they hope to do is to take those horrible pictures that would move any decent person. When you see children who are killed, when you see civilians who are killed, even in the most cautious war that can happen, and certainly in a case when you have an enemy that acts as Hamas does. What Hamas wants those pictures to do is they want it to lead to international outrage and pressure on Israel.
Dermer says when the world sees those pictures, the world needs to pressure the real culprit, Hamas.
And the question is, are we going to break this cycle of human shields? Are we going to finally have the pictures and pressure, lead to pressure on Hamas? If pictures lead to pressure on Hamas, the chances of them doing this over and over again go down. If they lead to Israel, you are actually not only endangering Israeli civilians, you are endangering primarily Palestinian civilians because they'll continue to use their own people as human shields. It's sick, it's grotesque, and it's got to stop.
During the conflict, Hamas rockets were found in 3 UN schools.
As a journalist who covers Gaza and UNRWA, I was not at all surprised that rockets were found in the UNRWA schools.
David Badin wrote, "Roadblock to Peace, How the UN Perpetuates the Arab-Israeli Conflict," and says UNRWA is actually hosting Hamas.
Our agency warned the United States government, the Canadian government, the European Union, and those are the prime supporters of UNRWA, that there was military training, military and weapons in the camps, in all of these UNRWA camps in Gaza. Our agency was ignored despite the facts.
Dermer says lawmakers on Capitol Hill are beginning to ask questions.
How did they allow their schools to be used as weapons depots? I mean, these are very, very serious issues that can corrupt the entire UN system, that are supposed to be there to protect civilians, are supposed to be there to help the innocent, not to allow their shelters to be used as basically military infrastructure for Hamas. It's just unacceptable, and more people are asking questions. We'll have to see what happens.
Not only does Israel face opposition in the United Nations, it's also fighting a battle in the media. If you look at some reports, you may not be getting the full story. Here's a look at some of the items you may not find in the mainstream media. Sometimes Israeli officials get frustrated with what they see as incomplete reporting.
Do you not think that it's relevant to report on CNN that the Secretary General of the United Nations yesterday warned against the use of UN schools and shelter for rocket missile depots of Hamas?
It's one of many questionable reports about the war. For example, scenes of destruction within Gaza have been broadcast all over the world. But you may not know some of that damage has been caused by Hamas.
Since the beginning of the conflict, we've had over 200 documented cases of rockets and mortars that were launched from within Gaza that actually struck within Gaza.
According to a Palestinian journal, at least 160 children died building those infamous terror tunnels. Rockets are fired from civilian homes, sometimes against the will of the homeowners. Dr. Lobel from Barzilai Medical Center once treated a woman from Gaza.
She told us that she and her husband were forced to be locked in their room, in their apartment, and the Hamas shot rockets from her courtyard.
The current Palestinian death toll is estimated at more than 1,300. This highly reported number, however, can be deceiving. The Mir Amit Intelligence and Information Center studied the Hamas figures and concluded the Palestinian numbers quoted by the UN, other international organizations, and the media are based mostly on Palestinian sources in Gaza, who have a vested interest in showing that we're killing many civilians. At the beginning of the conflict, according to Memory, the Hamas ministry issued guidelines of how Gazans should report the news. They said, anyone killed or martyred is to be called a civilian from Gaza. Don't forget to always add innocent civilian. Begin your report with the phrase, in response to the cruel Israeli attack. And do not publish close-ups of masked men with heavy weapons. Many homes are booby-trapped.
You walk into a kitchen, a booby trap on the toaster, booby trap on the refrigerator. It's the family booby traps. And I'm hard-pressed to think that Hamas did this at the last minute. Hamas prepared for this.
Israel's defense ministry supplies Gaza with tons of food, fuel, and medical supplies on a daily basis. While Article 7 of the Hamas Charter calls for the killing of Jews, Israelis don't celebrate the deaths in Gaza the way many Palestinians celebrate Israeli deaths.
Any Israeli that I know is horrified by the civilian deaths in Gaza.
The current conflict reminds some of the statement by the late Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. She said, "We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us." In the battle on the ground, Israeli soldiers are facing an unconventional enemy. Not only does Hamas target civilians, they also use women and children as human shields in their war against Israel. While diplomatic efforts go on, Israeli combat engineers continue to discover and destroy the vast network of Hamas terror tunnels. Israel sees these tunnels as an enormous threat to its population. One tunnel started from underneath the Wafa hospital in Gaza, and several came from the neighborhood of Sajaiya, the scene of some of the heaviest fighting. In the past 2 weeks, Hamas terrorists made several infiltrations into Israel using these terror tunnels, and Israel announced Hamas prisoners told of a mega terror event planned for the Jewish New Year. About 200 Hamas terrorists plan to kill and kidnap hundreds of Israelis along the Israeli-Gaza border. Hamas says the death toll climbed to more than 1,000 Palestinians, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu laid the blame on Hamas for the deaths.
Hamas is responsible for these civilian deaths. Hamas is not only trying to kill our people, it's sacrificing its own people, quite willfully, deliberately, cynically, and horribly. They are using their people as human shields.
So far, more than 40 Israeli soldiers have died in the fighting, and dozens have been wounded. Some of the wounded came here to the Sheba Medical Center in Tel Aviv. They came from the front lines and brought with them stories of intense fighting and how Hamas is using women and children as human shields.
My friends said a terrorist hid behind a little girl and shot at them, and they couldn't fire back because they didn't want to kill the little girl. They waited until one of the group succeeded to kill him. They shot him in the head.
And they hesitated, and this hesitation cost some of the soldiers their life, and some of the soldiers they got injured because they were surprised to see the women, and behind them came terrorists with machine guns and started to fire.
It remains to be seen how far the war will go on, but Israel would like to see the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip as one of the lasting goals of Operation Protective Edge. It's rarely reported, but some Palestinians living in Gaza are criticizing Hamas and calling for better relations with Israel. Our senior international correspondent George Thomas found a few of them and brought us these exclusive stories from the war zone inside Gaza.
Days after Israel struck Gaza's only power plant supplying electricity, Nidal Mihai's bread business has been firing on all cylinders because he uses a wood-fired oven.
We're in a crisis. People don't have electricity. They can't make bread at home, so they come here.
So who do people in Gaza blame for the war? Hamas or Israel? Well, even asking that question can potentially get you in trouble.
Business is certainly hopping at this. Shukran, Habibi, thank you. Business is certainly hopping at this traditional bread store here in Gaza City. That's hot. One of the things about That was really hard. One of the things about talking to Gazans, especially in the midst of this conflict, is you can never get an honest answer, because the reality is that many of the folks here are afraid. They're afraid to criticize the Hamas government.
We asked Milhai if Hamas has been good for Gaza. He smiled, then blamed Israel.
They're responsible. They must stop this war. Stop using bombs and missiles against civilian people.
But others like Faiza Ahmad Zahanin, whose family has reported ties to Hamas, told CBN News she wasn't afraid to criticize the group Israel and the US have labeled a terrorist organization.
The government in Gaza doesn't do anything. Even on the radio, they don't talk about how we are suffering. May Allah curse them.
A poll taken days before the conflict started found that 70% of Gazans supported better relations with the Jewish state. Ragda Hejazi is one of them.
We need peace with the Jewish people. Good relations, not war.
A mother of 5, Hejazi says Hamas has to change itself and bring stability to the region.
Hamas needs to find a way to solve these differences with Israel, America, and Arab countries.
Some, like Salim Hejazi, want to see brighter economic days on the Gaza Strip.
My message to the Israelis and Palestinians is this: find a way to solve the issues so that we can live an honorable life, a good life.
Weeks into that bloody war, Hejazi has had enough.
We need to be united and have peace.
George Thomas, CBN News, the Gaza Strip.
Up next, is the U.S. hurting or helping Israel in its war on Hamas? And why is the international community hostile to the Jewish state? Our Reporter Roundtable takes on the tough questions. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. To talk more about the situation here in Israel and Gaza is CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas and senior editor John Wagi. And George, you just came back from Gaza earlier today. Tell me what your impressions were.
Look, I think week 4, as we enter this Israeli offensive against Hamas and the militants in the Gaza Strip, clearly Gazans are very, very cognizant that the Israeli offensive has stepped up to another level. Right. 16,000 Israeli reservists have been called up, bringing the total number of reservists 86,000. That sends a very clear signal, not just to the Gazans, more importantly to Hamas. At what point does Hamas say, halas, as they say in the Arabic world, this is enough, we're done?
Quickly, you've seen, you saw things on the outside, looking at news reports. Yeah. On the inside, what were your impressions?
There is, to some extent, not all of Gaza is in ruins. That was the impression I got just watching the mainstream, the so-called mainstream media. But there are segments that are very, they're quiet, they're ghost towns. They're not all destroyed, but there is, like Gaza City and 4 major suburbs of Gaza City, absolutely, Sajaya and some of the other areas have really seen the might and the fury of the Israeli army.
Yeah. John, one of the big stories this week was the U.S. diplomatic efforts to bring a ceasefire, and they really seem to have backfired. What's your impression about Secretary John Kerry and what he's done?
Well, I think it's a reflection, first of all, of Kerry personally, just having a animosity from every spectrum of Israeli society, from the left to the right, and that's unusual. And not only that, you've got Mahmoud Abbas upset at Kerry at the same time. So you've got the antagonists who are usually fighting each other all on the same side against Kerry and the United States policy. This business of putting Israel and Hamas on the same moral plane and calling for an unconditional ceasefire on Israel's part has really gone down poorly, and it's a symbol, I think, of the reduced U.S. influence that's come from a number of decisions, whether it's Syria, whether it's the U.S. pullout of Iraq, you name it. The whole chaos that came out of Egypt and U.S. supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. The United States is really on the downslide in this part of the world. And as you know, Chris, we had Zvi Mazel, the former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, said that the only country left in the region that the United States has influence in now is Israel itself, and that seems to be dwindling.
And
I was just going to chime in and say that can you broaden that perspective about the America's dwindling influence in the region, but then you also see this is so emblematic of the chaos of what we call the Middle East, from the shores of Casablanca all the way to Herat, Afghanistan. You have this division. I sense that the war against Hamas and what's going on with Hamas is a reflection of the conflict in the region. that it's a proxy war. Who is going to hold the torch, sort of the voice in the Middle East? Is it going to be Hamas, Turkey, and Qatar? Or is it going to be Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United States on one side? So that's playing out so much more. Unlike, for example, the previous operations that Israel has engaged with, back then all of the Arab world was united against Israel. Today, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt are supporting Israel silently, but they would like to see the destruction, the end of Hamas, which is very interesting.
Yeah, this segment goes much too fast for this. But finally, George, you met with some Christians inside Gaza. How can people be praying for them and for the whole situation?
People are surprised that there are Christians in Gaza. Out of the 1.78 million Sunni Muslims on this tiny strip called the Gaza Strip, about 1,500 to 2,000, tiny population. Majority of them are Greek Orthodox. Then you've got Catholics and then Evangelical Baptists and so forth. But they're enduring, as are the rest of the population. They're suffering, but they're in the midst of that. They're hopeful. They're trying to encourage their fellow citizens to not give up hope.
John and George, this has been a brief but very insightful analysis and conversation, and we'll do it again.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Coming up, historian and diplomat Michael Oren on why victory is crucial, not just for Israel, but for the West as well. Michael Oren is Israel's former ambassador to the United States. He's an historian, diplomat, and a student of Israel's history. We sat down with Ambassador Oren, and he brings us a clear-eyed analysis of who Hamas is, their media strategy, and why this war is vital for the U.S. and the West. Well, Ambassador, great to see you again. You had an article recently about demilitarization of Gaza. What's the rationale behind that?
I think it's very important that Israel strive for it. Put it this way, it's not going to be easy to achieve, but that doesn't mean Israel can't establish it as not the principal goal, one of its principal goals in this operation. There are many precedents for it, the most recent being the removal of chemical weapons from Syria's arsenal. In both cases, the Syrians used those chemical weapons against civilians. Hamas has used its rockets against civilians, so the precedent is for taking them out. Hamas does not have so much as a military tactic as it has a media strategy. And it works very well for Hamas in the past. How does it work? Hamas or another terrorist organization like Hezbollah will fire rockets at Israel. It gets Israel to strike back, to move its forces on the ground. The terrorists are dug in deep behind the civilian population. They're using the civilian population as human shields. And so Israel, no matter how cautious it is, it invariably ends up causing civilian casualties.
It's almost as if we've seen this movie before, an Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and now Operation Protected
Unquestionably.
Edge.
It's the same strategy, and I've called in another op-ed that I wrote, I've called to basically give Israel a chance to break the cycle of violence. And that is an opportunity not only for Israel, but it's an opportunity for the United States. It's an opportunity for all freedom-loving people around the world, because if Israel defeats Hamas and really gives it a stinging defeat, then that is a message that will be internalized by other terrorist organizations. It'll be internalized by Iran and their nuclear program. If we don't defeat Hamas this time, then more civilians are going to die, because the next round's going to be bloodier, because Hamas will have more powerful weapons, they'll have more tunnels, more rockets.
So does Europe and the U.S., do they need to know that this is their fight as well?
They have to be reminded that Hamas, in terms of its ideology and its theology, is no different than Al-Qaeda, it's no different than ISIS or the Nusra Front. These are all radical Islamic groups that seek to create a unified caliphate to rid the Middle East of Christians and of Jews.
Is the international media complicit in Hamas's strategy?
The vast majority of journalists are just doing their job, and they want to bring home headlines. And having lurid pictures, heart-rending pictures, makes good headlines, makes good news. You can ask the question, why is it that the deaths of a certain amount of Palestinians on any given day gets far greater news coverage than the deaths of far more Iraqis at the hands of Iraqis or Syrians at the hands of Syrians do? Again, it's the way it's the dynamics of the news media. So most of these journalists are doing their job. Hamas has no compunction about showing dead people, wounded people, and if they actually don't have bodies or wounded people, they will fabricate them.
Is there another way that the message can be skewed? Because when journalists go into Gaza, they're not necessarily free to go wherever they want to go, and they're not necessarily free to report what they can report unless they're going to get threatened by Hamas.
What makes news? At the end of the day, media outlets have to make news, and you know, people have become benumbed in the world to the sight of Arabs killing Arabs. A bomb goes off in Baghdad, kills 60, 70 people, it makes the back page of the newspaper. It doesn't make the front page news. But if Israel were to kill 70 people, that would be the headline for 24 hours. Be very different. Now you can say that that's unfair to Israel, you can say it's racist against Arabs in a way. It's holding Arabs to a different standard, not just Israel to a different standard. But it's reality. And it's a reality with which Israel has to cope, has to grapple, and it's very much part of what goes on the battlefield. Because Israel has this wonderful army. I mean, we have a citizens' army. Where on earth do you have a democratic nation where right now 70,000 people, men and women, have left their jobs, left their homes, left their families to pick up arms to go out to fight for their country? And they fire, what now, 2,600 rockets at us. And do you see life stopping here? Do you see the restaurants emptying out? Do you see people not persevering, going on with their days? We are on the front lines here, and they're just never going to beat us, ever.
Ambassador Oren, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure,
Appreciate it very
Chris.
much.
Always, always. Good to see you.
Coming up, a perspective from an Israeli living on the front lines of terror. Finally this week, we talked to an Israeli living on the border, and she hopes one day her friends inside Gaza can live their lives without Hamas.
Before, we had people from Gaza that work here. And a long time after, we sent them some food and give them for the kids and everything. And every time they call us to say how we feel, if you are okay, they tell us how difficult the life is there. If they do the switch and understand they need to defend themselves, I'm talking about the Palestinians, and build their houses and start living, then it will be much better.
That's it for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time right here in Jerusalem.